So, this is a story from a long, long time ago. This story is from so far back that some of the events in this story haven't even happened yet. This story comes from this land, from Turtle Island, from out west of here, out in the Great Plains and the Great Prairies. It comes from a people of 3 tribes. The Kaina, the Piikani, and the Siksika. They came together and united into a nation. Today we call those people the Blackfoot. Now, those people living out on the prairie, they would dig roots, they would find things, sarvice berries, but mostly the way they lived is that they hunted the buffalo, the great herds traveling across the grasslands of Turtle Island. Now in those days, buffalo were not easy to hunt. You see, buffalo are very fast. They're very agile. They have sharp horns and sharp hooves. And they can actually have a pretty bad attitude. And if a person, a human being on foot, is out on the great prairie and a buffalo decides to charge you, well, there are no trees to climb. And there's no place to hide, and you're not going to outrun them or outmaneuver a charging buffalo. And one way to get them to charge is to walk up with a bow and arrow and shoot one of them in the ass. So buffalo hunting was a dangerous occupation, especially in the days before the horse came to Turtle Island. And when this story happened, it was in those days before the horse. But the people had figured out a way to hunt the buffalo. What they would do was that they would find a place on the prairie where there is a natural cliff or a cut bank. And they would build 2 walls, kind of a funnel shape, leading to the cliff and extending out onto the prairie. Low walls of rocks and brush. And then the people would hide behind the walls. And they would lure the buffalo into the area between those 2 walls. There were people who had a special medicine. They could call the buffalo in. And when the buffalo had come in to the piskun, the buffalo drop, into that area between the walls, the people at the end behind the wall would stand up and holler and hoop and wave blankets, and they would startle the buffalo and get them to stampede toward the cliff. And then more people would rise up as the buffalo passed and hoop and holler and carry on. And the buffalo would get more and more panicked, and they would stampede faster and faster and narrower into that little chute until finally they came to the edge of the cliff. And when the first buffalo got to the edge of the cliff, of course they tried to stop. But all the ones behind would push them over. And then they would be injured. They would have broken legs or broken backs, or some of them would be killed outright, and the people could then go and finish them off. And that's how the people hunted buffalo in those days. Now it so happened that the people were camped near one of these piskun, near one of these buffalo drops. But a funny thing had happened. For some time, there were no buffalo around. And then when they did see buffalo, it happened that they were unable to call them into the buffalo drop area. And other times they did get them in and they got them to stampede, but something would happen. The lead buffalo would turn quickly and lead the whole herd out of the piskun. And the people began to get hungry. And all their food reserves ran out. And the village grew quiet. There was no more singing and playing of the flute, playing of the drum, because hungry people don't have energy for that. And the fires didn't smell of cooking food anymore. They just smelled of smoke. And the children stopped playing, because hungry children don't have the energy to chase each other around. And the old people, started thinking maybe they wouldn't eat anymore at all and leave what little there was to the young ones. That was how it was. Well, one morning early, a young woman from the community got up to fetch water. She went down to the creek near the Piskun, and as she was about to fill her water skin, she looked up and there was a huge herd of buffalo standing right at the top of the cliff grazing. And she saw them, fat cows and large bulls and many calves. She was so hungry. And she said, as a kind of a joke, she said, "Oh, if only you buffalo would just run over that cliff, I would marry one of you." And no sooner had her words hit the air than that buffalo herd did turn, and it stampeded right off the cliff, and many buffalo were injured and dying and laying at the bottom of the cliff in a huge pile. But one great bull, the leader of the buffalo, jumped over the wall of the Piskun and came down the side, and in a few bounds he was standing next to her, and he took her by the arm and began to lead her off onto the prairie. And she said, "No, no." And he turned and said, "You said, if my people were to jump off the cliff to feed yours, you would marry one of us. Now you see my brothers and my sisters lying here." She tried to explain that it had been said as a kind of joke. But buffalo don't have a good sense of irony or sarcasm or comedic exaggeration. Buffalo are literalists. And so the great bull led her off out onto the prairie. Now, a short time later, some other people came to gather water, and they saw the buffalo there at the base of the cliff, and they called out, and all the people gathered, and they finished off the buffalo, and they butchered them. And once again, the campfire smelled of roasting ribs and fresh meat. And again, the people started to sing, and the children were playing. But after a while, people began to notice that someone was missing. A young woman was missing. They looked all over, and they took roll call, and they realized that she was not there. Now, this young woman's father was a great hunter and a great warrior. And so he gathered his quiver of arrows and his bow and some supplies, and he set out to find his daughter. After a little while, he found her tracks on the prairie. And he was interested to see that next to her tracks were the tracks of a large bull buffalo. He followed the trail for some time. A long time, or a short time, as they say. But one day, he came to a buffalo wallow, a place where the buffalo would roll in the dirt and the mud, and the grass was all worn away. And there he sat down on a stone and thought about how he might find his daughter. And while he was sitting there, considering the situation, a magpie landed nearby. He turned his head and looked at the man. And the father began speaking to the magpie. He began complimenting the magpie, telling the magpie what a handsome bird he was. And after a time of chatting with the magpie, he said, "You know, magpie, maybe you do me a favor. In your flying around, if you happen to see my daughter, tell her I'm here at the wallow, and to come meet me here." The magpie turned his head as if to acknowledge that, yes, he would do it, and off he flew. Magpie flew about here and there, but at last he came over where a herd of buffalo were camped, and looking down, he saw the woman. And so Magpie circled, and he came down, and he lit very near her feet. The magpie looked at her and said, "Your father's waiting for you by the wallow." And she said, "Shh, Magpie. My husband, the buffalo, is asleep. Don't wake him. He'll kill my father." my father that I'll get away when I can and come see him. And so the magpie flew off. And a few moments later, her husband, the chief of the buffalo, woke up. And he said, wife, would you fetch me some water? And he took off one of his horns for her to bring the water in. And she took the horn and she went down to the wallow. And there she saw her father. And he said, oh, I'm so glad to have found you. Let's get out of this place. And she said, no. It's very dangerous. My husband just woke up, and if I'm not back soon, they'll come looking for me, and they'll find us out on the prairie, and they'll trample us. They'll kill us. She said, you wait here, and when he sleeps again, when it's safe, I'll come and meet you, and we can make our getaway. And so she filled the horn with water and went back to her husband, the chief of the buffalo. Now he took the horn, and he took a sip of water, and he began to sniff it and roll it around on his tongue. And he said, there's a person nearby. She grew very frightened. She said, no, there's no one. And the buffalo took another sip of the water, and he said, no, someone's around here. And he let out a great moo. And all the young bulls began to moo and holler, and they began to shake their big heads, and they began to kick up the dirt, and their tails were up, and they were charging around. And he led the bulls down to the wallow, and there they found her father, and they trampled him, and they hooked him with their horns, and they smashed him and pulverized him until nothing was left of him. He was ground completely into the dust and the dirt. And the woman ran up, and she saw what they had done, and she cried, Nina, my father! She wept and fell on her knees, grieving for the death of her father. And the chief buffalo said, why do you do this? She said, you've killed my father. My father's dead. He said, well, you know, your people kill my people. You drive them over the cliff and they break their legs and their backs, and then you slaughter them and you eat them. Our brothers and sisters. Now you know how it feels. And he said, I will take pity on you, though. I will give you a chance. If you can bring your father back to life, I'll let both of you go. And so the woman began to dig around in the wallow, in the mud, but she couldn't find any part of her father. But she called out to Magpie, who was nearby. She said, Magpie, help me find some little piece of my father. The magpie began to peck in the dirt and look and peck a little more and look and claw a little and peck a little. And after a time, he felt something down in the mud. He pecked a little more and pecked a little more, and finally he pulled and pulled, and he pulled out a vertebra, a little bone from the man. And the daughter took this and cleaned it. And then she put it on the prairie grass, and she laid a soft buffalo robe over it. And she began to sing the morning song. She sung and sung. And it was so beautiful, all the buffalo gathered round to hear it. And when she finished the song, she pulled back the robe, and her father's body was completely reconstituted, but still, he was dead. So she put the robe back over him. And she sang another song, a song of the ancestors, a song of jumping up and living again. And then she pulled the robe off, and her father sat up and blinked as though he'd just wakened from a nap. And the chief buffalo said, that's amazing. You people have strong medicine. I will honor my word, but you must do this for us. You must do what you did for your father, for our people, after you hunt them. And then he taught the man and the woman the buffalo song. And he taught them the buffalo dance. And he told them how young men must put on the buffalo skull and the buffalo robe and become the bulls when they do the buffalo dance in just such a way, so that the buffalo may jump up and live again, just as her father had. And then the man and his daughter went back, and the people rejoiced to see them together again. And he taught them the buffalo song and the buffalo dance. And it may be that people still sing that song and do that dance to make the buffalo come back, to jump up and live again. But it may be that people have forgotten, and the story will have to happen again. Now, the whole thing was witnessed by a prairie dog, a young female prairie dog out there. She saw the whole story, and she took the story with her down into her burrow. And when she nursed her pups, the story went into them, and so it was carried underground by the prairie dog people for many generations and many hundreds of years. But one day, a young prairie dog got too far from the hole, and a red-tailed hawk took him. And so the story was carried by the red-tailed hawk people for many generations of red-tailed hawks. But one day, a great wind blew from the west to the east, and the hawk was carried on it a long way, all the way to Minnesota. And that hawk found a pretty young female red-tailed hawk. And they settled down near a lake in northern Minnesota. And they made a nest. And they had eggs, and the story was in one of those eggs. But a big wind came up, and the nest blew over, and one of the eggs fell down into the lake, and it broke. And little fish ate the egg yolk, and bigger fish, a big northern pike, ate the little fish. And one day, Tim Young and Jesse and I were up on that northern lake, and we caught a northern, and we fried it up. And I ate the pike, and the story went into me, and now I've told you.